Thank you very much indeed for coming along to tonight's very special event at Rock and Roll Politics. I'm Steve Richards and I'll be introducing my special guest in a moment. I call it Rock and Roll Politics, for those of you who haven't been before. It's a metaphor for politics all shook up, and we have very interesting guests and it all kind of goes in unpredictable directions each evening here. The last one was very interesting. We had Maurice Glassman, Lord Glassman, who was for about 10 seconds a guru to Ed Miliband. It's always a dangerous post to hold, gurus. They never last for more than about 10 seconds. And Philip Blond, and he's a Tory. He was called the Red Tory for a time. And that was really interesting, but there were moments when it became incredibly academic, and I was very, very alarmed. They started talking about the morality of crop rotation in Bavaria at one point. And I thought, this is going to only interest one person in the whole of the United Kingdom, and that is Ed Miliband, who is fascinated by anything to do with morality and capitalism. I remember last summer, at about this time actually, there was this conference on in Oslo, the hottest 2 days of last summer. And it was a conference about renewing social democracy in Europe. And I was invited to go along as a journalist, and we were in this hotel for 2 days, baking heat. And Ed Miliband was there the whole time. It was on a Friday and Saturday. And I said to the other people at this conference, God, I feel sorry for Ed Miliband. You know, his kids, his wife, it's sunny. He could be out on Hampstead Heath going running, which he's started doing. And so here he is, enclosed, talking about wither social democracy for 2 days, not seeing any fresh air at all. And late on the first night, he invited me up to join him for a drink. And my opening words were going to be, Ed, I'm so sorry that you're having to do all this. It must be terrible. And instead, I saw him and he said, God, Steve, this is such a breath of fresh air, this conference. He really loved it. And that's an interesting example of how politics goes way beyond what we see on the media on a daily basis and read in the media on a daily basis. But there's also no doubt at all that the media and politics is central to our lives. The New Labour era became famous, bizarrely in some ways, for this label spin. And as it was drawing to a close, I thought, I think this is going to carry on somehow. I'll tell you why I thought that. I was invited by David Cameron to go on this train journey with him to Norwich. But something very weird happened to me with David Cameron. I never got invited to Chequers or anything like that. But I was always invited to join him on a train to Norwich. It happened 3 times. I've never understood why, but there must have been some sort of grid where my name came up next to Norwich somehow. But anyway, on one of these trips, it was about 18 months before the general election, I was on this train with him to Norwich. And he got a call on his mobile phone. And he was had been fairly tired and looked kind of, as if this was all a bit too much. And this phone call said, what? It was from his office. Oh, that is fantastic. Really? Oh, I'm so happy. Oh, let the sun shine. That's marvelous, marvelous, marvelous. Thank you so much, George, for telling me that. I'm so thrilled. And he put the phone down. He said to his press woman who was with her, get some wine, we're all going to have a drink, this is absolutely fantastic. I thought, what the heck's going on here? Has he heard that Samantha is pregnant, or I don't know, that the polls now give him a 30-point lead? And so he said, well, what are we celebrating? He said, I've just heard Simon Heffer's been sacked from the Daily Telegraph. And he was on a complete euphoric high, and I thought, well, here we go. And of course, that preoccupation is a very, very common theme in politics. Gordon Brown's testimony to the Leveson inquiry got a lot of sort of attention for his claims about briefings and that he didn't know that briefings went on. But the thing that really surprised me was when he said at one point that he wasn't particularly interested in the media or the newspapers. One of his advisors told me that Gordon used to get up at 5 in the morning, read all the newspapers, and was therefore totally miserable by 5:30 in the morning. And he once, when he was Prime Minister, he switched from having this office, like Tony Blair had an office with his famous sofa and things. He got this completely open-planned office with big screens everywhere, with rolling news. It was sort of utterly conducive to neurosis and paranoia. It was a very big mistake. He should never have done it. And I'm told that on one occasion, he had brought Peter Mandelson back by this point. And they were all in this mad, open-planned office, Sky News there, News 24 there, 25,000 newspapers, blogs over there. And he was bashing away at something. It was only about 7 o'clock in the morning. And suddenly Peter Mandelson appeared from nowhere. Peter Mandelson had this knack of appearing just from nowhere. He didn't open doors or anything. You would just look up and there he was. It alarmed several cabinet ministers where they just thought they were getting on with their lives, and up they looked and there was Peter Mandelson. Anyway, there he was, bashing away at something. And Gordon suddenly noticed Peter had appeared from nowhere. Oh, hello, morning, everybody. He hadn't opened any doors, just appeared. And Gordon said to Peter, Peter, have you seen what's on page 14 of the FT today? It's a disaster, it's a disaster. What's on page 14, Gordon? It's a complete bloody disaster. He said, what is it? Gordon said, they've leaked the news, someone's leaked the news of my new press officer. Someone's leaked the news. Leaked, Gordon? Yeah, someone, look, it's there, page 14. And Peter sort of had a look at this thing. He said, Gordon, that news didn't leak. He said, what do you mean didn't leak? There it is, on page 14 of the FT. He said, no, it didn't leak. It seeped. And the news seeped out, Gordon. You can relax. What do you mean seeped? What do you mean seeped? And of course, he was obsessed, as Tony Blair was obsessed with the media, as virtually every prime minister has been. My favourite story, and it comes from another diary. I'm going to be talking a lot about diaries this evening. Tony Benn's diary is a classic. He chronicled everything on a day-by-day basis. Rather like Alastair, actually, late in the evening, in a slightly different way. He used a tape recorder to record everything. And there's a wonderful vignette of a cabinet meeting in about 1975, maybe 1976. The end of the sort of Wilson era. Wilson now completely paranoid about everything. Especially his own cabinet, with good cause, actually. Wilson called this cabinet meeting, and Ben says, Harold was absolutely strict with us. He said, if there are any more leaks to the media, the relevant cabinet minister will be sacked on the spot. Harold said he's had enough of leaks, they are utterly damaging, and they must stop now or else. Anyway, the cabinet took a break at midday, and I went out and bought the first edition of the Evening Standard with a cup of tea. And the front page story was, Wilson warns cabinet over leaks. Harold had leaked the fact that, anyway, you can get the rest. Talking of diaries, I think they are a fantastically rich historic documents. There's a kind of myth about diaries that they are unreliable evidence, that the writers are so obsessed with getting their own story out that it's utterly distorting of history. I don't think so at all. I think it takes you straight to the heart of events. And actually, one of the cliches about the diarists of that era, of the 1970s, is that if you took one day and read each of the three diaries, Ben, Barbara Castle, who was the other one? Richard Crossman. They would all be totally different. It's not true, actually. They record the same events, but obviously and openly from their perspective. And what we've got here with Alastair Campbell's diaries, and the latest volume covers an extraordinary range of things. Iraq, Gordon Brown, relations with the media, is an utterly absorbing and rich account right at the heart of government. And it raises many, many interesting questions. And while I was reading this volume, I've read all the volumes, I was wondering what I thought was different from reading these diaries to those of the cabinet ministers who wrote in the 70s. And funnily enough, as I was out running this morning, talking with my friend David Aronovich, who's also read this volume, I think we cracked it. And that's what I'm going to ask Alastair Campbell first, as we welcome him for this special event. Ladies and gentlemen, Alastair Campbell. I always say at the beginning of these things that it's slightly unnerving. In television, you have about 25 producers making sure the guest is all right, and I always wonder whether they're still there after the introduction. Can I ask you that question that we wondered about today? What is fascinating about this is that you are right at the heart of all the events, seen as an absolute key figure in the whole New Labour project and era. And yet quite often, when you write your diary, you're much more the journalist, Alastair Campbell, actually, than a player with strong views. In other words, quite often, you recount a conversation or an event, and then you don't say what you think. Can I give you one example from very early on? You and Peter Mandelson meet for lunch. It's the most extraordinary account, this. Peter Mandelson has been out of the cabinet. He slightly blames you for that, but that's by the by.
I think more than slightly.
Totally blames you for that. And Peter Mandelson says to you over this lunch, I'm really worried about Tony Blair. He's quite weak, actually. He's a weak political figure. He's nowhere near as strong as people think. And he needs us around, two much stronger figures, to support him at all times. If you go, or if I don't return, he won't really survive. You have that conversation with him again later on in the diaries, but you don't give your view. What is your view of Peter Mandelson's surprising assessment of Tony Blair?
I thought at the time was he not saying what he thought Gordon's strategy was? Well, which was in a sense to say that he had to, I guess, weaken Tony, and partly that meant Peter and I kind of being pushed aside. I think that, my view is that Tony got a long way by being underestimated by a lot of people. If you remember right back at the start, the first kind of line that the Tories ran was this Bambi idea, all things to all men, doesn't know what he believes, and all the rest of it. And actually, I think the reason why Tony became leader in the first place is because he always had this steel. And it was tested many, many, many times. So if Peter was saying that, I don't actually think that's what he believes.
So, but do you think it is the case? Is he right in his broader strategic assessment? It's very flattering to you and to him that without the two of you, he would have been in, let's put it this way, in a very weak position throughout certainly the final few years of his leadership.
No, I think what one of Tony's strengths as a leader was his ability to find good people that he needed and wanted, and also to have a different collection of people. So if you look at I remember when, shortly before Tony left as Prime Minister, he had a dinner at Chequers for all the kind of original team. Now, some of them people here will know. Peter was there, I was there, David Miliband, Pat McFadden, Sally Morgan was there, but also kind of secretaries were there and drivers were there, and we sort of had a really, really, really strong team. Jonathan Powell, really important. This very different collection of people. Tony never wanted to be surrounded by yes men and yes women. He wanted people to challenge him the whole time. And I think he is actually, I think he was maybe fairly needy at the start. And I was watching your introduction just now, and you were talking about him being obsessed with the media, and all prime ministers are. I would say that he started out that way, and maybe we both did, but latterly I think we changed. I think they reached a point where I certainly reached a point of, frankly, just not caring what the press said about us. What was important was what we did, and that we kept kind of getting out there with what we were doing. And I think Tony reached a point, as he said at the Leveson inquiry, he decided not to take on the media. He decided to, quote, manage, not confront. But at the same time, I don't think he was obsessed. Latterly, he didn't bother reading the papers, apart from he used to look at the media brief on a Wednesday morning when he had PMQs.
When you say you shared that view, what it comes across very clearly in this diary is that sometimes you weren't that indifferent. One of the common themes from virtually...
It was my job to care.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. You couldn't be indifferent given that job. But one of the common themes from almost the very opening days of this volume is that you, or part of you anyway, wants to get out.
Yeah.
You've just had enough of the British media and doing this particular job. It's a current theme.
Totally. And in fact, it probably goes back even further, because what was really difficult about this period, apart from all the obvious things, was that, I mean, one of the reasons I've done the diaries, and one of the reasons I'm kind of pleased the diaries are out there, is I do really think, I mean, you and I have talked about this, and I know you've kind of got more sympathy with this view than most media people have, that politics is a very, very hard job. Most people in politics are there because they have very, very strong beliefs. We're surrounded now by a complete and total culture of negativity. Most of it media-driven, but that's affected the way the public look at politics as well. And I think it's important that if we're going to get good people continuing to go into politics, that the public develop a better understanding of what politics is actually like. And the reality is that by now, I was probably pretty close to the end of my tether, because the other thing is, we all have families. I was in a situation where Fiona, my other half, who never wanted me to do the job in the first place, pretty much was reaching a point of saying, look, you can carry on with this job, but frankly, and I could see where it was heading, and I didn't particularly want it to head that way. But at the same time, I felt this incredibly strong loyalty to Tony and to the government. The thing that has always motivated me in politics is, I think we're all a mixture of the sort of positive and the negative. I've always been pro-Labour. I've always been very, very anti-Tory. I think a lot of what is wrong with Britain is wrong because we've had so many long periods of Tory government. And I did sort of feel by that point, I felt really bad about leaving, because, as you say, Tony was getting weaker as he went towards the end. But also, I kind of had reached a point of thinking, you know what, I have become a bit of a problem here, because this spin thing, I became so kind of associated with it. Now, my view is the media want me to say it was 6 to 1, half a dozen the other. I'll never say that because I don't believe it. I think it was about 10-2. I think it was the way the media was changing. I think it was so many people have said this at the Leveson inquiry, that television and the internet have forced newspapers to change. It's now all about impact. It's all about sensation. It's all about getting yourself on the telly, getting talked about. And the truth is kind of, let's not worry. We can worry about that later. And meanwhile, they feel, I think they're wrong. I think this is one of the reasons why they're in decline. They feel that the public only want to read and hear a relentless diet of negativity about people in public life. And I don't think it's true.
And I want to follow that thought as well. Could I ask you say it's 10-2. Could I just ask you about the 2? Did it give you a buzz?
See what I mean? Let's talk about the 10.
I'll ask you about the 10. There'll be plenty of time about that. In terms of the 2, when you transcribed this, did a part of you think, well, the real reason I didn't go, because I'm going to obviously come on to Tony Blair. For those of you who haven't read it yet, it's fascinating. Tony Blair starts talking about he wants to go, or is planning to go, during this second term, not the third term, and obviously ask about that. But was a part of you thinking, actually, this is bloody fantastic. I know you went through hell in many ways, but you centre of power.
Oh, yeah.
There is a sort of excitement about it. And were you all being a bit dishonest with yourselves, well, certainly you and Tony Blair, and keep on talking about wanting to go, when you actually stayed for quite a lot longer in both cases?
No, it's a very, very, very hard thing to give up.
Yeah.
And I think it's even harder if you're made to give up. For example, Gordon losing an election, John Major losing an election. I think that is a kind of really brutal event in anybody's life. And I can remember being with Neil Kinnock when he lost the 92 election, and it was horrible. So yes, there was definitely a part of me that wanted to stay, and it was in constant conflict with the part that wanted to leave. Yeah. And when these personal and political things collide, that's when life becomes very, very difficult. Yeah. So, and also the other thing, I mean, you do, when you're the spokesman and you are working for somebody else. I mean, I remember Jamie Rubin, who was Madeleine Albright's spokesman, very good friend of mine, and he'd left before me. And he said, you'll find when you leave, the hardest thing is working out what you really think again. And it's absolutely right, because
that's really interesting.
you're programmed, you train yourself to think like somebody else. Now, actually, Tony and I, we do think very similarly about a lot of things, but some things we're different.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, when when I'd left, I did find that very, very hard. And and then when you throw into the mix the fact that by the end, for example, Fiona was totally opposed to the war in Iraq, totally opposed to a lot of the public service reforms. And I was going home, so I was arguing with the media about these all day, and I was arguing with the politicians, and I was going home and arguing with her.
Yeah.
And actually, you know what happens, particularly in kind of, you know, those sorts of relationships, where you do at the end of the argument think, did I really believe that? Because you're just in a kind of, it's your position, it's what you have to say.
Yeah. One of the fascinating things about this volume and the previous one, actually, is probably inadvertently, you do convey now differences to Tony Blair. I mean, famously, education is the big one, but that was known at the time. You're a passionate believer in comprehensives, and I think you were opposed to the whole agenda that he adopted later on, and actually attended meetings when you had left, arguing against it. But that was known at the time. But I noticed, for example, things like in the previous volume, there's a fascinating account of, some of you might remember it, Tony Blair delivered a famous conference speech on the forces of conservatism. Anyway, in the previous volume, Alastair narrates...
Best conference speech of the lot.
But what was really interesting is that in the build-up to the speech on the forces of conservatism, the attack on the forces of conservatism, there was a fascinating debate within Number 10 on what you meant by the forces of conservatism.
Yeah.
And people like you and another special advisor, Peter Hyman, who you might have seen on Newsnight and things, wanted to make it a slightly more left-of-centre speech, more targeted on the Tories, the Conservatives. And you were pretty disappointed that Tony Blair didn't want to do that. That's one of several examples where I detected you personally.
No, I'll tell you what I was disappointed about. I was disappointed about the fact that there was this ridiculous manufactured reaction to the speech by the right-wing press, because there was this line about Stephen Lawrence and related to Nelson Mandela. I can't remember the exact line now, but basically it was sort of picked up, we talk about spin, it was picked up by the right-wing papers as Tony basically saying that these forces of conservatism, they were the reason why Stephen Lawrence was killed. It got completely kind of mangled and manipulated in that way. And Tony sort of, I think with the argument in Number 10 carrying on, he kind of retreated from what I think was a fantastic strategic framework about, because the forces of conservatism, we weren't just talking about the Conservatives, we were talking about, you know, people who were being held back in the education system, held back in the judiciary, whatever it might be. You know, poor housing is a force of conservatism. Low standards in education is a force of conservatism. It gave you that sort of, because you need that in politics, you need that sense of a strategic message that you can, this is where David Cameron, I think, has just never found one. And you need that in politics. And I thought it was a terrific speech, and I was disappointed that we kind of did the speech, made the impact, and then we slightly retreated from it.
But it is interesting because you became, as you say, it's 10-2, you didn't want to do this, a kind of big political personality yourself. But actually, you describe something very, very complicated going on in the fact that you are actually, your job is to speak for him, not you, isn't it? And It must be an extraordinary pressure. I mean, it's the pressure with the media, you've talked a lot about, but that must be an extraordinary pressure as well.
It's fine. It's fine because, you know, most of the time I completely agreed.
Right.
And also, this thing about the real Deputy Prime Minister and all that, the reason it was always nonsense is I was always very conscious of Tony's elected position as the leader of the party and as the Prime Minister. And even though we had a very, very close relationship, and he didn't mind if I took the mickey or swore or took the piss out of his clothes, as I often did, or whatever it might be, he didn't mind any of that, but I was always conscious of the fact that he was the Prime Minister. And what's more, I think was really, really clever and very, very good at his job. And I was very good at my job, which was, in a sense, part of my job was lifting the load of his job. Yeah. And so it was like, you know, I never felt at odds with him. The only time I did, as I say, was either one or two policy issues, and then when it got into the personal. So actually probably the worst time was nothing to do with policy. It was over that nonsense with Peter Foster and the flats in Bristol and all that stuff. Yeah. And when you get into that, it's just, you do slightly lose the will to live.
Yeah. Why? Just
because it's one of those stories that ultimately doesn't impact upon people's lives. It's not that important, and yet it is consuming 18 hours of your day, millions of words on the media, and you're having to deal with it. And as often happens, the media were picking us up, not on the fact, but the fact that my office inadvertently misled them because Cherie had said something, probably in panic, because she knew that Tony was angry with her, that turned out not to be true about this guy, Peter Foster. And you just think, how many millions of words were written about that, and how many lives did it affect?
Yeah.
Next to none.
Yeah. But that's where, curiously, tension between the two of you.
Yeah, it was difficult.
Was real and there.
Yeah, but again, Tony's a great. I mean, the other thing I must say on, at the end of that, I say this in the book. He called me and he said, "Look, I think we better just have a chat and clear the air there." And I said, I was in one of my kind of major grumps. I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "Well, I think you sort of left the reservation for a while," and it was a fair observation. And my job was to work for him. 95% of the time, I was absolutely... And the other thing I've got to say, I've been to Leveson twice now. I've been grilled at all sorts of inquiries and all the rest of it. I've had hundreds of negative things written about me and the operation we ran and so forth. We made very, very few mistakes considering the pressure that we were under. In terms of, I'm talking about media, dealing with the media now.
The media operation.
Yeah.
We'll obviously come on to Iraq, which clearly plays a central theme in this book. But as a sort of way towards it, when you say you sort of emerged and got back to your real persona and real life post being his sort of representative.
I'm not sure I'm there yet.
Or are you still not? It takes several years to get back to... And looking back, there is a fascinating question about his judgment in these diaries. Not integrity, but judgment. Another running theme throughout this whole volume is his passionate desire to get Britain into the euro. Yep. He wants to do it by 2004, before the election in 2005. He even contemplates offering to go by the end of the second term if he can get this referendum on the euro. What the heck was he thinking about?
Well, no, he is. I mean, I think I talked to him recently actually about the euro. He's still very pro-euro, and I think he still believes that Britain's future fundamentally lies within Europe, and that I think if he were here now, I think he'd say that he could envisage one day whether it's going to be the same euro as we have now, but he could see Britain being part of a single European currency.
But the scenario he draws up in many conversations with you, it's again, we're going to come to this as well, the relationship with Gordon Brown is central to it, would have been absurd. I think he was going to move Gordon Brown to the Foreign Office, declare he was going to stand down before the next election and fight a referendum on the euro.
Well, none of those things happened, did they?
No, but clearly that was his... And did you sometimes go home and think, well, I really like this guy. I think he's a terrific leader in many ways. But this is... I mean, you don't put that in the diary affairs. Again, you keep yourself out of it, but you chronicle many of these conversations.
Yeah, well, he really believed in... I mean, I was always more Eurosceptic than Tony, and part of that was because of my experience at European summits.
Yeah, as a journalist.
As a journalist and as a government official, because, I mean, I used to hate them. And one of the reasons was that it was... I mean, my degree's in languages. I mean, I can work my way around Europe and all that. But I did have this constant feeling that actually, do you know what? These guys are really trying to make something fit here that doesn't feel like a fit to me. And I think that, for example, the problems that we've got at the moment with Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Greece. I mean, should those countries have been in the single currency? If the Maastricht criteria had really, really, really been applied? So there was a political drive. And look, Tony, he believes in that political project. He really, really does. Now, and the other thing, this is where, again, the clash between policy and personality becomes so difficult to unravel. Because, as you've said, this is a period where Gordon is kind of, really, he's pressing. I think I say at one point in the diary that Tony says that he doesn't mind the differences on policy. He doesn't mind the personality clash. It's when he thinks there's a policy read across from the personality clash. So in a sense, he was feeling that Gordon was coming out with this different line on the euro, not because he believed it, but because of the battle between them, as it were. And
do you think that was right?
No, I don't. No, I don't. On that, I don't. I think Gordon, I think I've said to you before, I think in terms of who was the wrong, Stefan Stern tweeted this thing today. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, having read the extracts in The Guardian today, and he said it was like it came across like a marriage where they regularly think of killing each other but never think of divorce. And I thought it was absolutely spot on. And I think there's on that in terms of, whenever there's a sort of marriage breakup and people say, well, who do you blame? Weighing up the responsibility. I think Tony was more wronged than wronging. I really do have quite a lot of knowledge of that. But I do also think, and this is why, I've written my blog about this today, again, defending Gordon and his reputation, because I still think that people underestimate, for all that he could be a nightmare, underestimate the positive that he brought to the government, and also the brilliance of his mind when he was on song. And, I've always spoken as I find, he could be a nightmare, but he was also brilliant.
The nightmare theme is very strong in this book, as you would be the first to admit. It's unavoidable. Yeah. Every few pages, there is another meeting where you describe Gordon Brown not talking to you, treating Tony Blair with utter contempt, Ed Balls doing the same. Now, I think there probably is a case for the defence, which I'm going to put in a second, beyond even what you've said, not about the behaviour, which was clearly, there's, Tony Blair has...
Just bear in mind in a diary, and particularly with This Is Me, quite a, depressive personality and so forth, I'm probably in any event usually putting a more negative spin on things than... Because partly what my diary is, and certainly was during that period, it's like an emotional dumping ground.
Yeah.
I go home every night, I'm quite often exasperated, quite often exhausted just because of the sheer workload, and all the time I'm having to think about the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And I write my diary, I don't now because I do it electronically now, but I wrote my diary then in an A4 notebook. I writing shorthand, and then I've got a pad next to it where I'm writing things for the next day, and the problems that we're dealing with and what have you. So it's not really a full account of every day. Sure. It's what I'm what's still in my head at the end of the day. Sure. And that often is the negative stuff.
Yeah. But some of it, again, is not your thoughts, it's reportage.
It's what people say.
You're standing with Tessa Jowell having a conversation, and Gordon comes straight past both of you, doesn't acknowledge you, and she just looks up and says, that man's fucking insane.
I know, I was really shocked that Tessa swore. I really was.
And there's lots of this. So before I put a partial alternative to you, tell me what you think about that behaviour now when you look back. I know you would openly say it's selective and you're doing it as a cathartic, but it must have... Well, tell us what you...
Well, I said on my blog today that I think if the big hitters in the government, in the Labour Party and the government, had really, really, really worked and carried on working as a team, I think we'd still be there. I don't feel any intellectual challenge from what modern conservatism is bringing forward. Obviously, time and longevity and really big, difficult issues like Iraq and tuition fees, all these things erode your support. But I think if Tony, Gordon, John Prescott, Peter, Blunkett, Reid, myself, all the kind of, the strategic team in particular, if we'd have all stayed together, I think we could still be there.
Still be in power.
So I feel, and that's not about Gordon's behaviour, but I do think that that sense, in a sense, that behaviour, some of which you've described, it reflects what became a disunity. And the history of the Labour Party, look, you know, until Tony came along, we'd never won 2 full terms, right? We won 3. We stopped the Tories getting a majority at the last one. I think we changed the political argument, but my worry is that now that the Conservatives are back in, they can even with a coalition government, they can push a lot of things back, and they're pushing a lot of things back already.
Yeah.
So I think on one level it was intolerable.
Yeah.
But more importantly, is just the really big lesson in this is, you know, do your level best to stay united. And the reason why I did get so exasperated is because, in a sense, I felt, you know, as you know, I'm utterly obsessed about sport. In fact, I'm amazed to be here when there's football on the television.
Yeah, I thought you were going to put that out.
I've got to say, if Ireland had been in with a shout tonight, but the thing is, I think you can learn so much from sport about team building, and I felt that was kind of part of what I did. I'm a team player. I was always trying to keep the team kind of, you know, together, and it was difficult. And
I'm going to come back to the Gordon Brown thing in a minute. By the way, there'll be plenty of time for questions. Since you mentioned sport, let's do a brief diversion. What comes across to me in your diaries, there are 2 people you really like and are really relaxed with, and you love talking with. One is John Prescott in the political world.
It's not always relaxed.
Not always relaxed. But you kind of not at all relaxed most of the time, no. Actually, was it? But you could clearly like him. The other one is Alex Ferguson. And in fact, in the previous, he crops up quite a lot in this volume. The previous volume, you are talking politics on a very regular basis. He's absolutely committed Labour supporter. And you often went to Tony Blair to say, look, Alex says we should be doing this, that and other.
In on policy. My favourite one of that is when he said to us during the 97 election campaign, and he said, look, I'm watching the telly and you guys, you're looking a bit stressed. He said, you really got to get a masseur on that bus. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if we'd have had a masseurs on the bus? But no,
so he didn't always follow the advice.
But he is very political. I mean, he's a very close friend, and the thing about him, I think, again, Tony did this as well. You all, if you're in that bubble, always have people outside the bubble. And you see, with me, once Fiona was inside the bubble as well.
Yeah.
So that was quite difficult. So, you know, keep your old friends and make sure you talk to them. So somebody like Alex, who's, you know, very, very high profile, got very strong views on the media.
Shares yours.
We had very, very similar views about that. Understands strategy, understands pressure, understands team building. Reads a lot of history. I mean, I happen to know because I was talking to him today. He's on holiday at the moment reading a book about de Gaulle, which I read a month ago, which I sent to him. He just sent me a text today, loving this book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's actually written by, do you remember an MP called Aidan Crawley who went on to set up ITV?
Yeah.
This guy is a very rare person. He was elected twice as an MP, once Labour, one Tory. But anyway, forgive him. He's written a brilliant book about de Gaulle. So no, Alex is a very political guy, but he's a great friend, and he's somebody who, I mean, I was once helping him out in a situation when he I think this is in this volume, where he was, you know, the press were kind of up to no good, and he said this thing about he said the true friend is the one who walks through the door as others are putting on the coats to leave. Yeah, and it's spot on. Yeah,
just out of interest, have you ever asked him whether he's troubled by the vast sums of money they all earn?
I have, yeah, and in fact. And he's not. I think he's troubled he might be troubled by the impact upon the game. And he still does a huge amount for sort of grassroots football and what have you. But I remember once saying to him, do you not find it really difficult dealing with these kind of multi-millionaire superstar footballers? And I think actually it's part of what he enjoys in the job is that it's not just about the tactics and the rest of it. He's also having to manage these massive egos, and that's why there is such a read across now to
politics.
Yeah.
and the media.
Yeah. And I'll tell you the other thing, you can learn. Tony used to be obsessed, because Tony watches a lot of football, as you know as well. He used to be as interested in the after-match interviews as he was in the...
Yeah,
in
I
the
always think they're the
he
most
just
interesting
loves
bit.
watching those guys, because they contractually obliged, they've got to, there's the match, they've got to come out and talk straight away. And you can learn so much from about the character of somebody from seeing that instant after-match interview.
Yeah.
And you can learn from the way the good ones do it.
Yeah, yeah. I thought Harry Redknapp was very good at the media.
Brilliant. I think Wenger's very good at it.
Yeah. Anyway, let's return to Gordon Brown briefly, and then...
Gordon would have been a great manager of Arsenal, I think.
Do you not think, famously, of course, and there's no question, part of it was a kind of almost deranged jealousy and frustration over the leadership. That's absolutely clear and comes across. But what they used to say to us lot, journalists, as you know, and I know you
when they weren't briefing against Tony.
When they were briefing against him, actually. Yeah. And it seeed to me at times sincere. They actually you mentioned Fiona's doubts about the public reform agenda. You had it with education. They used to say to people like me, look, we've just put our necks on the line to put up taxes to pay for increases in the NHS. And now this guy, Alan Milber, wants to come along and give hospitals the freedom to go bust. We cannot have hospitals closing when we put our neck on the line. We've got to stop it. And it struck me as sincere. They meant it. And there were other moments when they used to say, what Tony, is doing is going to be catastrophic in policy terms. And that fueled the anger. Now, the mistake he made was to set up an alternative court instead of dealing with these things and occasionally perhaps getting sympathy from you and others. But I got the impression it was more than just fuming ambition. But I think you disagree with that.
Well, no, I don't disagree entirely. But what I would say is that, look, you know Tony, right? For all he was the Prime Minister and everything else, he's an incredibly reasonable bloke. He's not unapproachable. He's very easy to talk to.
Yeah.
He's very interested in other people's arguments. It was, so you mentioned something, say, like the foundation hospitals.
Yeah.
That was an argument to be had. And there are ways to have those arguments.
That was the mistake.
So what I describe in the book is Alan Milburn, who's the health secretary, picking up newspapers and reading about a 44-page letter that's been sent to every member of the cabinet saying why his policy's crap. I mean... And Alan, I think, rightly saying, how would he feel if I went out tonight and made a speech about economic management?
Yeah.
So I go back to the team point. And I also think that, I think Gordon, I think sometimes that this happens in politics because it's, tribes develop. But I think sometimes some of the people who felt themselves very close to Gordon, they didn't serve him well by going out and sort of, doing in Tony and saying that he was basically just a Tory and all this sort of stuff. It didn't help anybody. The thing about, it was... that's why I say, when we were all together on the same pitch, we were pretty much unbeatable. We were unstoppable as a political force, and we scared the hell out of the Tories. And when they started to feel they were getting back into the game was when they just saw that these divisions were opening.
Yeah.
So, all I would say to those guys who were talking to you then, they shouldn't have been talking to you, they should have been talking to Tony and to Alan and to Charles Clarke and John Reid and the rest of it, and they could have sorted the policy out.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Iraq, which obviously is a huge feature of this volume of the diaries, what I found quite interesting is that it sort of comes quite quickly. Yeah. In fact, very early on, you have Ian Duncan Smith saying, or actually you say, Tony said to you, I'm a bit worried that Ian Duncan Smith is pretty right wing over this, reacting to September the 11th.
And pushing us on Iraq.
He was pushing on Iraq. Start, and both you and Tony Blair were worried by this, saying this is a right wing reaction to September the 11th.
Yeah.
And yet, that ended up being your reaction too. Make the link between your worries about Ian Duncan Smith saying that and then being in the same position that you, not you because you were representing Tony Blair, but you've said you agree with it, then became convinced that the rational response to Afghanistan was to then go to Iraq.
No, I think Tony and lots of others said at the Chilcot inquiry this phrase, the calculus of threat changed after 9/11, and I think that's the point. But I think the point I was making about Ian Duncan Smith, is that in a sense...
He was Tory leader at this point, by the way.
Or Ian Duncan Baker, as George Bush called him. Because there was a golfer at the time called... but Ian Duncan Smith... no, I don't know, but our sense was that he was kind of realising that Tony was in a very, very difficult position and was kind of just trying to pile the pressure on.
Right.
Whereas actually the fundamental argument that framed what followed in relation to action in Afghanistan and then in relation to Iraq was this point that up to 9/11 there were threats that everybody knew about that the world and the Americans in particular were in a sense willing to tolerate, even though they felt very worried about them and very provoked by them. But after 9/11, actually these were threats that had to be confronted. So Afghanistan was the first because of the their harbouring of Al Qaeda and their non-cooperation in relation to that, and then Iraq for all the reasons that we know about.
Yeah, and then was this something where you were saying very early on that basically from 1994 to when you left, you had to largely, make sure that you were thinking like Tony Blair. Presumably in the build-up to war, you know about politics, he does, that you must have had personal doubts at some point, but presumably you can't let them surface at any point, even when your own partner, Fiona, when you go home at 10 o'clock at night, is expressing absolute opposition.
You can express them. You can express them internally.
Did you? They don't appear in here.
It does. I'll tell you what I think does appear in there is my concern at various points that the Americans were kind of pushing us too hard, and my concern at another point that actually this just politically for Tony is a disaster. And I think I am, but I'm doing it. I go back to the point I made earlier about the fact that he always wanted to be challenged. And I can remember a discussion, I think it was Sally Morgan and I, saying to him, look, there is the possibility that this is going to lead to you being finished before your time. You do know that, don't you? And I said to him, is it worth it? Is it really worth it? And he said, it's in the book, it's always worth doing what you think is the right thing. Saddam has been a problem for too long. We've turned a blind eye for too long, and that includes Britain. Now, that was his view. And I think one of the most interesting exchanges in the whole book is when Jack Straw is pressing him in a similar way. And Tony says, Jack, I've got some really sort of bad news for you. I really, really do believe this. It wasn't a tactical thing. It wasn't about America. It wasn't about George Bush. Now, George Bush was he was the leader of the United States. He was, although to be fair to him, after 9/11, he wasn't going down that Ian Duncan Baker line. He was actually quite cautious for a while.
Was he? Really?
Yeah, he was.
You really didn't think?
I do.
Soon after that, you
I think some of them. No, I think immediately after 9/11, there were people within the American administration who were saying, right, it's Iraq. And I think Bush was actually, this may really worry people, I think Bush was a calming voice on some of them. But when it came to the real crunch, and this is why I always do defend Tony on this, he's not having to write a column or give an answer in an opinion poll. He's got to make a decision.
And keep them once you've made it.
And the other thing to remember is it wasn't a question of make a difficult decision or make no decision at all. No. Whatever decision he made was difficult. Yeah. Because, as he says at various points, a fundamental rift with the Americans on a basic a foreign policy issue as that had consequences the other way as well. And also he says at various points, he said this in the House of Commons in the debate that led to the vote that led to troops going in, that he didn't want it on his conscience that they knew there was a threat, we did nothing, and one day we did wake up and find that weapons of mass destruction and rogue states had come together with these terrorist groups and, worse than 9/11 had happened.
Yeah. I suppose, again, forget about it became an issue about integrity, which I'll obviously ask you about in a second. But to raise the judgment issue, did you ever have doubts, as you did with the euro, did you ever think, my God, is he right about this? That there is this coming together of...
I did, yeah. On that big argument, I did, yeah.
Have doubts?
No, I agree
doubts.
with it. I agree with it.
Okay.
I agree with it.
Okay.
Look, I had doubts. I don't think you'd be human if you didn't think about it. And this is why I get so... I don't mind. I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to disagree with the decision, to say it was wrong. But at least understand that if you're in the position that he was in and the position that we were in, you really, 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 really do think about it.
Yeah.
And you really do agonise about it. And it was, I say in the introduction to the book, it wasn't black and white.
No.
Sometimes in politics you have to present things like black and white because you're trying to lead a country. He was trying to lead the country into a really, into what was going to be a very difficult situation.
Publicly he couldn't make any qualifications.
So he couldn't stand up and say, on the one hand, on the other. He could do that, but then he said, look, I really believe we have to do this. Because especially when you're asking, and this is the other reason why I got so kind of, angry, and to be honest, still do get angry in relation to the whole kind of thing with the BBC, is it's just unravel what they were saying. They were saying that we were inventing intelligence, presenting it to Parliament, so that we could persuade the country to let Tony Blair send soldiers to go over there and get killed. That's what they were saying. I mean, to this day, I cannot understand how they think we could have just let that lie.
On the dossier, I know you're absolutely adamant about the inaccuracy of that report, which then became incredibly famous. I think Tony Blair said to me and others that he now wishes they had just published the intelligence raw. Do you feel that?
I don't think the intelligence agencies would have let that happen.
Really?
No, and I think they'd have been right not to. I don't think they'd have let that happen.
Well, and what comes across in your book, and presumably something you will continue to assert, is they retained control of that process. They did.
And what's more, I mean, again, as I said at the Leveson inquiry, the Hutton inquiry and the reporting of it is a classic example of what I call media spin. The Hutton inquiry was as detailed and thorough and as difficult as an inquiry as I can imagine. And because it didn't reach the conclusion that the media wanted it to, it became instantly called a whitewash, and nobody ever talks about what he reported anymore. Yeah. But actually I think he went to the only place where the evidence could take you, which is that report was wrong, and they should have withdrawn it. They should certainly have investigated it better than they did. And, without being too heavy about it, if they had done that, then there is one person who is now dead who would be alive. And that's David Kelly.
Well, I'll ask you about that in a moment. But several times in the book, I think including this sequence, since you mention it, I'm going to mention it because it's in the book. Your partner, Fiona, says, look, hold on a second. You're an obsessive. This is getting out of hand. I don't know whether she did it in this sequence, but she does say it several times. Do you think maybe looking back, or did you think it at the time? This is obviously before the death of David Kelly, which we'll come on to, that this is potentially quite dangerous.
Do you mean the dossier?
Sorry, no, your public onslaught against the BBC. I know you think you had to do it because, in fact, funnily enough, Robin Cook, who had resigned over the war and opposed the war, I did, and the paper I worked for did, but he told me on the day of the Gilligan report, it was littered with inaccuracies. That was Robin Cook. So clearly you felt you had to respond to it. Did you worry at the time, or retrospectively, that by placing yourself so centrally in the public arena?
As soon as you say placing myself, I was summoned to 3 select committees.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not placing myself. I was called to the Intelligence Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and ultimately the Hutton inquiry. So when people were saying at the time, he's become the story. I mean, if I can completely, murder the English language, I was becomed the story. I didn't ask. And that's why I say it all flowed from that one report. All the thing about the dossier, the one that went to Parliament in September 2002, and even that briefing paper that became called the dodgy dossier and so forth, I could have, all the questions of that, I could deal with them, I did. But the reason I became so central in this The one place where you could argue, and where Fiona certainly did, that I could have reined back was when I allegedly stormed into Channel 4, which again is nonsense. I mean, they knew that I was turning up, but I did. There's no doubt. In fact, Tony said I could. He said, "Do it, but don't lose your temper." Now, I did slightly lose my temper, but I've read, when I prepared for the Hutton inquiry, I can remember reading the transcripts of that interview, and I wouldn't withdraw a word of it. The tone could have been managed better.
Is that what he said to you afterwards? Did he watch it?
He did. He didn't watch much news, but he did watch that.
He did watch that interview. It's fascinating with politics sometimes. An event can happen that changes the way people perceive what was going on before.
Well, it's happened to Murdoch now.
It's happened to Murdoch now. It's a classic thing. It's that the Millie Dowler revelations changes our perception of the past. You were having what was an interesting battle with the BBC, but it was no more than that. When you heard about the suicide, it felt like a lot more than that, I know. And for you, the stakes were incredibly high, but obviously the emotional charge transformed itself. You write in the introduction to this book that the death of David Kelly, even now, makes you not want to go back into full-time politics. It obviously had a profound impact.
That period did, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was the worst point of that period. And it just, even now, I just feel so sad about it because, the guy should be alive. I didn't know him. I never met him.
Yeah.
But he was clearly a very decent bloke and did a very, very good job and all the rest of it. And the only mistake he made was to have lunch with a, in my view, thoroughly disreputable journalist, and to say things whether, and this, I mean, he had an unauthorised contact with a journalist. As you know, it happens every day in every restaurant, in every pub within a 3-mile radius of the House of Commons or Downing Street. No big deal. But for whatever reason, the fact that he became caught up in this huge kind of public row that was going on and became, in a sense, one of the pivotal figures, and he took his own life, and I do think about that. I do think about it because it's it's horrible to think that happened, and I do think about whether we could have done things differently. But I don't believe we could not have challenged that story. And you see what the BBC people who still now kind of rewrite history the whole time, they say, oh, well, it was just a throwaway remark at 7 minutes past 6 in the morning. The next day, it led virtually every newspaper in the world. Yeah. It was leading every bulletin in the world because it was the BBC.
It wasn't only at 7 minutes past 6 either. They headlined it every 15
There was the
minutes.
lead story.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at the media now, I mean, by the end, you were kind of just had it with the media. I mean, the book begins with you almost had it with the media. By the end, you definitely had it with the media. What is your view of this Millie Dowler phone hacking thing? Seems to have been a watershed moment.
Well, I hope so.
You hope so. You don't think it? You think it might not be? What do you think will happen with the Leveson?
Well, David Cameron didn't want to set up an inquiry. He resisted it for ages. The Millie Dowler, and again, it's odd how sometimes it will take something just to create a tipping point.
Yeah.
And the phone hacking business was rumbling on. It had been going on for years. But it wasn't, as it were, fundamental. The Millie Dowler revelations tipped it. And David Cameron is a savvy enough politician to realise it had gone to a different place. I think what we've seen since the inquiry unfolded is why he was so worried about having an inquiry. My worry, you see, I think that, Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg, John Major, Tony Blair, if you look at all their evidence, which went before David Cameron, they were, I think, I'm not saying this was planned, but they were setting it up very, very nicely for David Cameron to be able to go along and say, there is a consensus forming. You, Lord Justice Leveson, do appear to be asking all the right questions, and we, the politicians, actually should just broadly endorse that. Subject to the detail, obviously, but broadly endorse that. He didn't do that. He, I think, is still looking to find a way to use this to get the press back on board. And that says to me that we've learned, if that happens, we've learned absolutely nothing about the last 20, 30 years.
Do you think that's the most likely
outcome?
outcome?
Well, Michael Gove went to the press gallery lunch and said, this inquiry is having a chilling effect on freedom of speech. He went to the inquiry, and Michael Gove is not any minister, as you know. Michael Gove is very, very close to David Cameron. I don't believe he did it unlicensed.
Yeah. Okay, finally, and then we're going to open it out for questions. I must ask you, one of the other constant themes in the diaries is your running, which you really take up.
My running?
Your running.
Yeah.
And you reach extraordinary speeds as you prepare for the marathon, sort of from your house in North London to number 10 in about 10 seconds.
No.
And today when I was out running, as you know, with my friend David Ronovich, we were talking about this, and David tweeted about it and said that we were amazed at your running speeds. How did you reach these speeds? And you just tweeted one word back: mania. Were these really cathartic moments, the running?
Well, it's interesting. You know, people think that I'm a kind of lifelong fitness fanatic. I didn't start running until 2002, when I was putting on a bit of weight. I was, hanging around by the pool, and one of my sons, Rory, who's a very keen runner, he said, why don't you come for a run? I went out for a run, and, being obsessive, the next day I decided to do the London Marathon. And then I started training. And I entered the marathon. I got in touch with leukemia research because my best friend had died of leukemia. I got a thing going with them. The marathon, this is one of the blessings of my terrible profile. The marathon were really excited about this. So they gave me Hugh Jones. Do you remember Hugh Jones, the Olympic marathon runner? So I trained with him, and I just got into it. And I don't run as much as I did. I'm now kind of into cycling is my big thing. But I think my best time was 28 minutes from Hampstead to number 10,
fast.
Which is not that fast.
Pretty. You should see the way.
And I've got to say, I was on Regent's Park Canal the other day, and I got overtaken by a rather large woman, just down from here, actually. So my running is not what it was.
Not what it was in this volume of the diaries. Well, look, that's the sort of introductory talk. It's now a chance to ask some questions. So if we could have, what's the time? Yeah, we've got some time for questions. Can we have the sort of light on so we can see a few? So what would I think the sensible way of doing it is to take 2 or 3 at a time, actually. So who would like to start off with a question to Alastair Campbell? I've got 20,000 more, but I think you'll have them. At the back there, I think there's a mic as well,
Just shout
actually.
out. We can always repeat if we can't hear. Mics are really slow in my...
Just wonder if you could say something about relationship with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in relation to the Iraq War, which Gordon in public seemed very, very reluctant to ever say anything about, at least in the early times and up through the 2005 election. But what was your view of what was going on behind the scenes there?
On Iraq?
Yeah.
Can we just get another couple in? Because I think there will be a lot of questions
okay.
when we get the thing going. I'm quite nearby where the mic is, and...
Hi, with Sarah Wollaston and various other MPs recently openly speaking about their experiences mental health-wise, do you think we're reaching a bit of a watershed moment? Do you think perhaps stigma, particularly in public life, might be on the wane?
Right, yeah. Of course, you've done a lot on that. And, as an
Shout
ebook.
out and I'll repeat it.
Okay.
You go on.
Yeah, I was really interested in what Alastair had to say about divisiveness within the Labour Party. Bearing that in mind, I wonder what his thoughts were on the disastrous result for Ken in the mayoral election and where this leaves Boris in regard to national politics.
Okay, 3 very different questions.
No, I think on Iraq, I think Gordon, it's true that in the early days, as the argument in a sense was being made, that Gordon was fairly low profile on it, but I don't think it was because of a division. I think it's because Tony was doing a lot of the kind of diplomatic heavy lifting, as it were, and with Robin Cook and then Jack Straw. And actually, when it came to I can remember I think it was the weekend when we went to the Azores, I can remember actually, it was one of those times when Gordon was kind of so on song that I was having one of my why can't he be like this all the time moments. So I don't think he was I think on Iraq, I know he got a lot of criticism. That was when this whole thing about McCavity became a bit of a kind of running issue. But it wasn't my recollection. I mean, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer as well, and there was all that. He had a big job. I don't think there was a problem there. On I'll come to mental health in a minute. On the divisiveness point, and Ken, I don't know really. I mean, I think it did become a bit of a personality contest, and I think that in a sense people just felt Ken he'd been mayor. He said and did some pretty daft things during the campaign, and there were various points where I just kind of held my hands, and held my head in my hands. I don't think Boris is that great. I think he's perfectly funny, quite likeable, posh Tory. By the way, if you haven't seen it, go and see Posh at the Duke of York Theatre. It is brilliant, and it will make you feel ill. But it is brilliant. I mean, I think, to be honest, I go back to the point I made to Steve about we need really good people to go into politics. I mean, Boris is a big character. I'm not taking that away from him. But if we've really reached the point where people are saying that the choice of Prime Minister is Boris Johnson or David Cameron, I worry. On the mental health, it's funny that I don't know if people are aware of this. I was disappointed actually didn't get a lot more coverage. You had 4 MPs for the first time ever standing up in Parliament and saying they have mental health problems. And it made a bit in the Independent and a bit in the Guardian. I don't think it was even on the news bulletins. I thought that should have been a big moment. And somebody put a thing on my I did a blog about it, and somebody put a thing on my website saying it was 10 years ago last week that I did my first event for mental health media. I came out partly because I had no choice. Because what happened with me, I had a breakdown in the 80s. I've had depression on and off ever since. And I was quite well known in Fleet Street when I had my breakdown. Nobody batted an eyelid. There was a few paragraphs in Private Eye and that was it. The minute I started working for Tony Blair, the phone calls started. People started to write about it. And I just made the decision there and then, I'll be open about it. I'll tell what happened and what have you. I've written a novel about mental illness. I've written a little ebook, The Happy Depressive, about depression. I'm very proud of my mental illness, if I can put it like that.
Could I ask you about that, actually? There's an exchange in this diary where you say to Tony, well, there are lots of exchanges where you say to Tony Blair, I'm really depressed. And at one point, but that's sort of almost kind of a joke.
Put yourself together.
You put yourself together. And then at one point he said, are you clinically depressed? Yeah. And you said without hesitation, yes. Yeah. Do you think that there were times even with all that pressure that you were clinically depressed as you were dealing with all this stuff?
Well, no, I was.
You know you were. Yeah.
I know I was. I was on the pills.
Yeah.
I get depression every now and then.
Yeah.
And it can be very, very bad. And it doesn't have to be related to the events. It can be related to absolutely nothing. But I thought what was great about the debate last week was that you had Charles Walker, who I knew about, OCD. You had Kevin Jones, who I didn't know about, coming out about depression. You had Sarah Wollaston, I think, talking about postnatal depression. And you had this lady that I don't know, Andrea Leadsom, who John Bercow, by the way, tells me is one to watch, who talked about, I think, depression as well. Now, the truth is, the mental health camp, I'm involved in this Time to Change campaign, we talk about 1 in 4. I think that's a conservative estimate, by the way. But if it's 1 in 4, that means we've got about 170 to go in the House of Commons. And I think that, I often talk about, in one of my favourite films about campaigning is Milk, the gay rights campaigner.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant film, and what I love about it is that it starts with this guy, Harvey Milk, kind of walking down the street and getting beaten up because he's gay, and it ends with him on the steps of Congress being hailed as a hero because there's been a change. Now, on that arc, you can't tell where the change comes, because it's actually about change of attitudes. It's not about the law. We changed the law on, civic partnerships. The Tories now trying to change the law in relation to gay marriage. But it's not about. It's about changes. You couldn't change the law if you didn't have the change of attitude. And in relation, you use the word stigma, we still have the stigma. Otherwise, you wouldn't just have had 4 MPs being open about having mental health problems. And the thing about, I know people who are mentally ill who say that they find the stigma and the taboo and the sense of discrimination that it creates worse than the symptoms. They can manage the symptoms because they take pills or they've got a supportive family, whatever it might be. But they actually, the fact that when they're filling in a job application form, they feel, I can't answer that. You know, when were you last in hospital? When did you last see your GP? Have you ever been advised to stop drinking? All these sort of questions that actually you talk about mental illness and people want to lie. And that reinforces the stigma. And I just want to get to a situation where we feel we can be as open about our physical health as we are about our mental health as we are about our physical health. If I was on crutches now, you'd go, oh, have you broken your leg? If I was bald suddenly and I was on a course of chemotherapy, you would know how to talk to me. But when we see people who are talking to themselves on a park bench or sitting there with a bottle of scotch, we just, the instinct is to walk away. And I think that's what we've got to break down. And the reason I'm really worried about it at the moment is because for all the Tories talk about they're not cutting the National Health Service, mental health services are being cut piecemeal right around the country. Camden up the road, 2 of the 4 acute care places have gone. My GP, the alcohol support guy, he's gone. It's happening all around the country and nobody's batting an eyelid. And if you've got MPs speaking out, you've got a better chance of stopping it happening.
Very interesting. Let's take some more questions. Yeah, at the far end there.
Just wondering, you talked about the internet a fair bit. I was just wondering whether you think there will be broadsheets in their current paper format, I suppose you could say, in say 15, 20 years' time.
Okay.
Down here in the front row.
Shout out.
Do you want to shout out to save time? Thanks. It is coming, actually, the mic. But.
Extending slightly the simile between sports and politics, are you shocked by the vast sums that former politicians such as Tony Blair are currently earning? And do you think the fact that he has a relatively bad image in Britain today is ultimately shows the failure of spin?
Interesting questions. The woman about 4 rows up, 5 rows up. Yeah, thank you.
What do you think of Murdoch as a man? Is he a jittery old man or is he an evil genius?
Good questions.
Yeah. The broadsheets. Steve.
Are they dying in front of our eyes?
This could be the newspaper man in me. I think there will always be newspapers. I think there will always be that desire to allow somebody else to shape a product that you kind of feel comfortable with. I don't like reading the newspapers online. I do look at them online, but I don't enjoy it. I read books. I've got a Kindle, and I might take it if I'm going on a flight or I'm going away for a week or something, but I prefer to have a book. And I think the broadsheet, I think some of them will go, no doubt about that, and some of the tabloids will go, and provided it's the Daily Mail, I certainly don't give a shit about that. But I think some will go, some will stay, but I kind of have a feel there'll be newspapers in some form will be around, I think. The sport and money, you see, again, is it a failure of spin, you say? He certainly gets a very negative press, but so do most people in public life. He gets more of a negative press, I think, in part, I'll come on to the money, but I think in part because people in the media, I think there's a sort of feeling with a lot of the ones that really hate Tony, they never really got him when he was there. And they're still they kind of want to get him still now that he's gone. And so, for example, on the money, you only ever hear one side of the story. Tony now employs, I think it's about 100 and odd people. not least because he's running charity projects in Africa. He's got 3 big projects going in Africa. Have you ever heard about those? Do you ever read about them? Do you read about his sports foundation that he runs with his own money? No. So I'm not pretending he doesn't have a nice life. He does have a nice life. He's got a very nice house in London. He's got a very nice house in the country. He's never going to want for a penny. But I don't think, I've never thought that Tony Blair was somebody who, as it were, was motivated by money. I think he's doing politics / a sort of public service in a completely different way. And, you know, I think, is it a failure of spin? I think it's kind of, because he's not worrying about getting elected anymore, I think he's kind of reached the point I reached a while back of not being that bothered what the British papers say about him. And when he goes around the place, yes, he gets the odd guy turning up in an inquiry and walking through the judge's chambers and saying you're a war criminal. But actually, when he goes around the place, he gets a pretty good reception from most people because whatever else they think he's a bit of a phenomenon. The Murdoch as a man. Discuss. He's very clever. He's very ruthless. He's got very strong views. And he has used his business instincts and his understanding of the way the world was changing to make himself a very, very powerful figure. It's not in this book, but when you've got that one, you can get the other ones. And the first one, in fact, I had to read this out at the inquiry. Yeah. Because I was asked about this conversation I had with Paul Keating, the Australian Prime Minister, when we were in opposition, where Keating said the thing about Murdoch, you can do deals with him without anybody ever saying a deal's being done. And the other thing he said, the thing you've got to remember with Rupert is in his world, it's Rupert 1, Rupert 2, Rupert 3, the family, the wife and the kids 4, the business interests, then the wife and the kids, and then everything else is a long way behind. And that's true. And I think in a way, I think what the News International papers got up to and the way they tried to cover it up and some of the stuff that has emerged is horrific, and they're going to pay a price. But it's interesting I did a conference recently in London where the Australian pension funds industry came over here, and I was asked to go along and make a speech on the theme of the debate was, is Murdoch now so toxic that his companies have become uninvestable? Now that is a reputational, it's gone from there to there very, very, very quickly. And he will not be happy about that. Because, it's sad in a way. He's got huge strengths and huge abilities, but I think like a lot of people, when they get to that, they overreach. And maybe not him, but certainly James, his son, overreached and has done a lot of damage.
Okay, we've got time for one more set of questions. Yeah.
I know who that is, by the way. She goes to school with my daughter.
Ah, okay.
Well, in relation to the current affairs of the NHS reforms and stuff, do you wish that there was anything you had specifically done differently for Labour to potentially go all the way and avoid a Tory government?
On health, specifically?
Like this. Well, just because you...
Could we have done more and better to stop the Tories getting back?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. At the front
just shout
here.
out.
And then,
shout
out while the...
Have your views on lobbying changed since when you were in government and now where you're working for a public affairs company? Okay. Do you think it's a problem in this country?
Have my views on lobbying changed? I do work part-time in a company called Portland. And is it a problem for Britain? You're right at the back.
Famously, there were Blair's babes. Women in politics, I think, face particular problems in terms of the way that they're covered in the media. Yeah. And also the children of politicians, I believe, should be off limits for the press. And I think the fact that they're not is quite a barrier to women and men entering politics. I wonder what your point
is.
Okay, and this is the last set in the middle there.
Yeah, I just wonder how you feel about the rumours that Cameron and Gove and co really still idolise Blair and your team. And I wonder whether that makes you feel proud or another emotion.
Right, okay. I have to say, I do quite a lot of public meetings, and I think equality of questioning is above average.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, there you are.
Above average. And I've also had a couple tonight that I've not had before, which is rare. Which is rare. If I may start with @Anna Sirius, as she is known on Twitter. Is there more that we could have done? I mean, inevitably, yeah. I think on health, which you mentioned at the start, I mean, what really, really, really upsets me about what's happening in the National Health Service, when we left, satisfaction ratings with the National Health Service were their highest in its history. And I saw a survey last week, and it's had the biggest fall in its history in the last 12 months. And I mean, I had to speak to my GP about something today, and I mean, they're just going spare with these reforms. So I'm not sure we could have done that much more in the National Health Service. I think we could have done. I think we could have done more on what I call the kind of cultural front. I don't mean arts, culture, things like this. I think we did a lot of good on that. But I'm thinking of things like, I mean, I had this spat at the weekend with Armando Iannucci about the honours system. I think we could have done more on things like that. I think we could have done more.
Scrap them.
Well,
you would have done,
he wouldn't. Tony would never, ever have done that because he thinks they were, he didn't think it was a priority. But I think certainly bring them into the modern world. And I think that, I think we did well on education. I think we did well on the health service. I think the fact that the Tories think they can unpick a lot of this stuff means, to be honest, we didn't do well enough. They got elected by not daring to threaten to change the National Health Service fundamentals,
they would argue,
and they're now doing it without a mandate, without a majority.
They would argue, to follow the other question, that they're following Tony Blair's agenda.
They do argue that. Gove, in particular, does argue that. Lansley doesn't, because I think Lansley lacks a certain political feel. But they do that. But interestingly, there was you asked whether we feel flattered or whatever, and it really. Cameron, he regularly has a pop at me. He's done it several times in the House of Commons. He did it again at the Leveson inquiry. And yet, when I sort of speak to his people and say, why does he always do that? And they all say, he actually thinks you lot were brilliant. They do. I know they do think that, and they do say that. However, you should look up. I can't claim to be the biggest fan of Fraser Nelson, right-wing commentator, but he wrote a very insightful piece recently. I can't remember if it was right in the Telegraph or the Spectator or both. He wrote a piece somewhere where he said that the Blair government was, quotes, obsessed with media management. Cameron government obsessed with media management. He said the difference was the Blair lot, they worked out a strategy first, and then they drove it through the media. Cameron has still, not, in my mind, not worked out a strategy. Is it the big society? Is it all about the deficit? Is it decontaminating the brand? Is it we're going to be the most green government ever? He comes out with these different top priority, number one priority. Everything he talks about is the big thing that he's going to do. He doesn't have that sense of strategy. And I think, so, I don't care what they say about us. I care about what they do now, and I just don't think they've got a strategy and they don't know, what they're meant to be doing. Lobbying, I was always pretty unlobbyable, I think. In fact, I don't remember lobbying companies ever trying it on with me, really. And I think it's how you kind of put yourself out there that people will get a sense of whether you can. And again, when I see I'm not denying that we weren't close to News International, that we didn't court the media and what have you. But I tell you what, I like to think there's no special advisor that ever worked with me that would have been that whole Fred Michel, Jeremy Hunt thing. I mean, honestly, it's just so beyond anything I could have imagined. And the thing about, I think there's nothing wrong with lobbying companies. What is wrong is if politicians and public officials allow themselves to be wrongly influenced. And again, I can't say I like this government very much, but other than the Jeremy Hunt thing, I've not seen huge evidence of that. I think lobbying companies have got a place, but I think it's really, really, really important that there's within the DNA of every politician and every civil servant, they've got a job, you've got a job, they're totally different. They're totally different. There's nothing wrong with listening to other people's arguments, though. And finally, on the Blair babes, and I agree with you about that. I mean, sometimes I think you have to make moves of positive discrimination to make change happen. The only time when a disproportionate number of women have come into Parliament was 1997, when we had, we changed the rules so that you would end up with more women. And I think that was a good thing to do. And I think, again, like a lot of these things, I think Cameron pays lip service to it. They have got more women in than they've had before, Tories. But I think if you're really going to break the mould, you've got to say, we've got a problem here, and we're going to do something which some of you won't like to change it. And I would certainly support that if they did it. And I think all the parties should think about getting more women engaged. And your point about children, it's not just, it's families more general. I mean, I sometimes, when Dennis Thatcher was around and Maggie was Prime Minister, I mean, okay, there was a bit of media intrusion. There was the Dear Bill stuff in Private Eye, but Dennis could he could go about his business. He had his business stuff. We could go on foreign trips and regularly see him a few sheets to the wind and just sort of say, let's not bother report, let's just, who cares, But now, a wife, a husband, a child, a dad, a mum, a brother, they're considered fair game. And you're absolutely right, it puts people off going into politics. And it's wrong. And I hope that it's one of the things that Leveson comes down, is very, very clear about. The tragedy about what's happened with the press, if you read, you're obviously political anoraks, otherwise you wouldn't be here, right? Go home tonight and Google the Press Complaints Commission Code of Conduct, right? And read it. It's a brilliant piece of work. And if the newspapers had actually abided by it, it's got things in there about the children of public figures. You're not allowed to cover the children of public figures simply because they are the children of public figures. Well, has that been obeyed? Of course not. And, we, the political class, you just reached a point. I can remember, is it in this book, or When Did Ewan Get Drunk? No, it was before this.
It was the volume before.
Well, Ewan probably got drunk more than that, but
the
volume where we made the decision when we heard about this, and actually looking back, very intriguing how the press found out before we did. Wondering about Scotland Yard again.
Yeah.
But the thing is that we said right at the start, I remember the PCC wrote to the level, because I said the PCC had been pretty useless at this and the other. One of their cases, their points they made in their defence was they said that, but when it came to Ewan's being found drunk in Leicester Square, that the PCC had a word with the press and it wasn't quite as bad as it might have been. The reason for that was I phoned John Wakeham and said, by the way, we do accept this is going to get reported. They didn't stop it being reported. We do accept it, and we just sort of took it on the chin. But I think as a general rule, and what the press are very good at, though, so for example, they say, but this MP, he had a picture taken with his wife for his leaflet when he was elected in 2001. Therefore, they're all fair game. It's nonsense. It's hypocritical nonsense. All they want to do is get into the sex life of the MP, get into the, what their kids get up to and all the rest of it. And I think we're really, really in danger of stopping very, very good people thinking about a political career because of the way they get covered.
Okay, Oscar, will we end where we began, the relationship between politics? I mean, you'll hang around to sign copies of this book.
Well, only if they buy it.
Yeah.
Where is that?
You have to go. No, if you go out there, if you get ready, and I'll finish it.
Oh, so you mean hold on? You mean I don't get the last word?
You don't get the. The media always gets the last word.
Right. Okay. All right.
Alastair Campbell,
thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Get that book. It's an extraordinary story which brings you right to the heart of things in a way that is very thought-provoking. We could have carried on for hours, actually. There are so many issues raised by it. But I thought I would end by, as we've been focusing quite seriously about politics and media, with a hilarious story which exposes the sheer absurdity of the media at times as well. Told by a friend of mine, I think it's here, Tim Brearley, who was an editor at GMTV and TVAM. And this story goes back to the 1980s, but it's worth reviving because it's so funny. You only told me about it the other day. In the late 1980s, by the way, you have to know this. Have you all heard of the character in Coronation Street, a legendary character from the 80s called Albert Tatlock, yeah? It's important that you know this figure. He was a legendary figure in Coronation Street in the 1980s. Anyway, TVAM, familiar story, were going through cost-cutting measures in the mid to late 1980s. And the new owner of TVAM said, look, we've really got to cut. Let's get down to basics. And they agreed that they would cut the newspaper, the live newspaper review on the Sunday morning programme, which was then presented by David Frost. Save the newspapers, taxis, newspaper reviewers' fees, cut it out. Frost was very perturbed by this and said, right, how do we get around this cutting? Let's do a mock newspaper review, pre-recorded. Let's do it for a bit of fun, just to liven things up. So Frost came up with this idea, and they had a mock newspaper to do it. Probably cost them as much as the live newspaper reviews. This was in a period when Britain was really up against it in Libya, and Gaddafi was threatening all kinds of things. So they cooked up this story in a mock newspaper that Colonel Gaddafi was threatening to kill Albert Tatlock in Coronation Street. And sure enough, they got on two really vivacious newspaper reviewers who were good kind of actors to, the mic's gone, to take part in this pre-recorded newspaper review. And so sure enough, as the programme went out, David Frost said, and joining me now, anyway, the both newspapers, well, this is really shocking, David. Do you know what they're doing? Colonel Gaddafi aims to target Albert Tatlock. Unbelievable, disgraceful, what are we going to do? Save Albert Tatlock. Anyway, as this pre-recorded newspaper review was going out, the duty newsroom editor got a call from a Sunday newspaper saying, look, I think I better alert you to this. The actor who plays Albert Tatlock has just died. And they checked this out, and sure enough, they got it confirmed that the actor, who was quite old, he was a very old character in Coronation Street, had indeed died. In between this pre-recorded newspaper review, there was a news bulletin. And they had no choice, because it was a huge story. It was a massive star, this figure. They had no choice but to report the fact that the character who plays Albert Tatlock had sadly died overnight. Then they went back to this pre-recorded newspaper review. So, poor Albert Tatlock, let's go and defend him against Colonel Gaddafi. And so the people watching this thing assumed that Colonel Gaddafi had indeed succeeded in killing off Albert Tatlock. What made things really worse, it was in the days of sort of rushed kind of ticker tape. There was no kind of graphics and things. And so they decided at the end that they better repeat again the sad death of the guy playing Albert Tatlock, but they bashed it out in a panic, and it came up on the screen. We are sorry that Walbert Tatlock died in his sleep this morning. Even that got wrong, and it was a complete catastrophe, as half the nation thought Colonel Gaddafi had killed Albert Tatlock. And it just shows there is an absurdity to what was otherwise a very serious discussion about the media and politics. Thank you all very much for coming along. As I say, Alastair will be outside. Some of us will hang around for a drink. But if you want this book, which I really do recommend, and get his signature on it, he'll be out there. Thank you all for coming. See you next time. Thank you very much.